toward analytical psychology. In 1916, Jung wrote several essays and a short book in which he began to attempt to translate some of the themes of Liber Novis into contemporary psychological language and to reflect on the significance and the general application of his activity, the general applicability of his activity. Significantly, it was in these works that he presented the first outlines of the main components of his mature psychology. He attempted to translate what he had learned from the spirit of the depths into the language of the spirit of the times. A full account of these papers is beyond the scope of this introduction. The following overview highlights elements that link most directly with Liber Novis and the Black Books. In his works between 1911 and 1914, Jung had principally been concerned with establishing a structural account of general human functioning and of psychopathology. In addition to his earlier theories of complexes, he had already formulated conceptions of a phylogenetically acquired unconscious, peopled by mythic images of a non-sexual psychic energy, of the general types of introversion and extroversion, of the compensatory and perspective functions of dreams, and of the synthetic and constructive approaches to fantasies. While he continued to expand and develop these conceptions in detail, an additional concern begins to emerge strongly in these papers: the attempt to provide a temporal account of higher development, which Jung termed the individuation process. This presents the central theoretical result of Jung's self-experimentation. The full elaboration of the individuation process and its historical and cross-cultural comparison would come to occupy him for the rest of his life. In 1916, he presented a lecture to the Association for Analytical Psychology entitled "The Structure of the Unconscious," which was first published in a French translation in Theodore Flournoy's Archive de Psychologie. Here he differentiates two layers of the unconscious. The first, personal unconscious, consisted of elements acquired during one's lifetime, together with elements that could equally well be conscious. The second was the impersonal unconscious, or collective psyche. While consciousness and the personal unconscious were developed and acquired in the course of one's lifetime, the collective psyche was inherited. In this essay, Jung discussed the curious phenomenon that resulted from assimilating the unconscious. He noted that when individuals annexed the contents of the collective psyche and regarded them as personal attributes, they experienced extreme states of superiority and inferiority. He borrowed the term godliness from Goethe and Adler to characterize this. God-likness from Goethe and Adler to characterize this. This state arose from fusing the personal and the collective psyche and representing one of the dangers of analysis. Jung wrote that it was difficult to differentiate the personal and the collective psyche. One impediment was the persona, one's mask or role, which represented the segment of the collective psyche, often mistakenly regarded as individual. When one analyzed the persona, the personality dissolved into the collective psyche, which resulted in the release of a stream of fantasies. All the treasures of mythological thinking and feeling are unlocked. The difference between the state that ensued from this and insanity lay in the fact that the former was intentional. Two possibilities presented themselves. One could attempt to regressively restore persona and return to the prior state. However, it was impossible to get rid of the unconscious. Alternatively, one could accept the condition of god-likeness. A third way presented itself, which consisted of the hermeneutic treatment of creative fantasies, which resulted in a synthesis of the individual and the collective psyche, revealing the individual's lifeline. This was the process of individuation. In a subsequent, undated revision of this paper, Jung introduced the notion of the anima as a counterpart to that of the persona. He regarded both of these as subject imagos. He defined the anima as how the subject is seen by the collective unconscious. The vivid description of the vicissitudes of the state of god-likeness can be taken as representing some of Jung's affective states during the self-experimentation. The notion of the differentiation of the persona and its analysis corresponds to the first entries of Book 2, where Jung set himself apart from his role and achievements and attempted to reconnect with his soul. The release of mythological fantasies is precisely what ensued in his case, and the hermeneutic treatment of creative fantasies was what he presented in Layer 2 of Liber Novus. The differentiation of the personal and impersonal unconscious provided a theoretical understanding of his mythological fantasies. It suggests that he did not view them as stemming from his personal unconscious, but from the inherited collective psyche. If so, his fantasy stemmed from a layer of the psyche that was a collective human inheritance. They were not simply idiosyncratic or arbitrary. In October of the same year, Jung presented two talks to the Psychological Club on adaptation and individuation. The first was titled Adaptation. The process took two forms: adaptation to outer and inner conditions. Inner was understood to designate the unconscious. Adaptation to the inner led to the demand for individuation, which was contrary to adaptation to others. The answering of this demand and the corresponding break with conformity led to a tragic guilt, which required expiation and called for a new collective function. This was because the individual had to produce values that could serve as a substitute for his absence from society. These new values enabled the reparation of the collective. Individuation was for the few, those who were insufficiently creative should reestablish collective conformity with the society. Not only had the individual to create new values, he had to create socially recognizable values, as society had a right to expect realizable values. Read in terms of Jung's situation. This suggests that his break with social conformity to pursue his individuation had brought him to the view that he had to produce socially realizable values as an expiation. His self-experimentation had to result in a work that presented new values in a socially recognizable manner. This led to a dilemma. Would the form in which Jung embodied these new values in Liber Novis be socially acceptable and recognizable? The second talk was individuation and collectivity. Jung argued that these two states were a pair of opposites related by guilt. Society demanded imitation. In analysis, through imitation, the patient learns individuation because it reactivates his own values. It is possible to read this as a comment on the role of imitation in the analytical treatment of those of his patients whom Jung had now encouraged to embark on similar processes of development. The claim that this process evoked the patient's pre-existing values was a counter to the charge of suggestion. In November, while he was on a military service in Hiroshima, Jung wrote a paper called The Transcendent Function. He depicted the method of eliciting and developing fantasies that he later termed active imagination and explained its therapeutic rationale in psychological language. Strikingly, there is no indication in it of the wider cosmological, metaphysical, and theological exploration that he himself was engaged in. He noted that a critical problem confronting analysis was the fact that the new attitude gained from it subsequently became obsolete. Unconscious materials were needed to supplement the conscious attitude and to correct its one-sidedness. But since energy tension was low in sleep, dreams were inferior expressions of unconscious contents. Thus, other sources had to be turned to, namely spontaneous fantasies. There are a few dreams noted in the Black Books. A recent recovered dream book contained a series of dreams from 1917 to 1925. Close comparison of it with the Black Books of this period indicates that Jung's active imaginations did not derive directly from his dreams, and that these two were generally independent streams. Jung describes his technique for inducing spontaneous fantasies. The training consists, first of all, in systematic exercises for eliminating critical attention, thus producing a vacuum in consciousness. One commenced by concentrating on a particular mood and attempting to become as conscious as possible of all fantasies and associations that came up in connection with it. The aim was to allow fantasies free play, but without departing from the initial effect in a free associative process. This led to a concrete or symbolic expression of the mood, which had the result of bringing the effect nearer to consciousness, hence making it more understandable. Merely doing this could have a vitalizing effect. Individuals could draw, paint, or sculpt depending on their propensities. The visual type should concentrate on the expectation that an inner image will be produced. As a rule, such a fantasy image will actually appear, perhaps hypnagogically, and should be carefully noted down in writing. Audio-verbal types usually hear inner words, perhaps mere fragments or apparently meaningless sentences to begin with. Others at such times simply hear their other voices. Still rarer, but equally valuable, is automatic writing, direct or with a planchet. Once these fantasies had been produced and embodied, two approaches were possible: creative formulation and understanding. Each needed the other, and both were necessary to produce the transcendent function, which arose out of the union of conscious and unconscious contents. For some people, Jung noted it was simple to note the other voice in writing and to answer it from the standpoint of the I. It is exactly as if a dialogue were taking place between two human beings. Dialogue led to the creation of the transcendent function, which resulted in a widening of consciousness. His descriptions of the use of inner dialogues and the means of evoking interplay of creative formulation and understanding corresponds to his work in Liber Novis, which contains both elements. In 1917, Jung published a short book with a long title, The Psychology of the Unconscious Process, an overview of the modern theory and method of analytical psychology. In his preface, dated December 1916, he proclaimed the psychological processes which accompany the present war, above all the incredible brutalization of public opinion, the mutual slanderings, the unprecedented fury of destruction, the monstrous flood of lies, and man's incapability to call a halt to the bloody demon, are suited like nothing else to powerfully push in front of the eyes of thinking men the problem of the restlessly slumbering, chaotic unconscious under the ordered world of consciousness. This war has pitilessly revealed to civilized man that he is still a barbarian, but the psychology of the individual corresponds to the psychology of the nation. What the nation does is done also by each individual, and so long as the individual does it, the nation also does it. Only the change in the attitude of the individual is the beginning of the change in the psychology of the nation. The great problems of humanity will never be solved through general laws, but always only through the renewal of the attitude of the individual. War made visible the chaotic unconscious, while collective events could release the demons of the unconscious. The only resolution lay on the individual level. In a language that recalled William James' essay, The Moral Equivalent of War, he asserted every individual needs revolution, inner division, dissolution of the prevailing, and renewal. This would be achieved through self-reflection and a return of the individual to the ground of human essence. Understood in this manner, analysis could furnish the basis of cultural renewal. This articulated the intimate interconnection between individual and collective events that was at the center of Liber Novis. For Jung, the conjunction between his precognitive visions and the outbreak of war had made apparent the deep subliminal connections between individual fantasies and world events, and hence between the psychology of the individual and that of the nation. What was now required was to work out this connection in more detail. Jung noted that after one had analyzed and integrated the contents of the personal unconscious, one came up against mythological fantasies that stemmed from the phylogenetic layer of the unconscious. The psychology of the unconscious process provided an exposition of the collective, suprapersonal, absolute unconscious, this terms being used interchangeably. He argued that one needed to separate oneself from the unconscious by presenting it visibly as something separate. It was vital to differentiate the I from the non-I, namely the collective psyche or absolute unconscious. To do this, man must necessarily stand upon firm feet in his I function. That is, he must fulfill his duty towards life completely, so that he may in every respect be a vitally living member of society. Both of these tasks, separating from the unconscious by presenting it visibly, and at the same time maintaining one's worldly duties and responsibilities were what he had been endeavoring to do in this period. In Transformations and Symbols of the Libido, Jung had called the contents of this unconscious typical myths or primordial images. He also called them dominants, the ruling powers, the gods, that is, images of dominating laws and principles, average regularities in the sequence of images, and the brain has received them, and that the brain has received from the sequence of secular processes. One needed to pay attention to these dominants. Especially important was the detachment of the mythological or collective psychological contents from the objects of consciousness and their consolidation as psychological realities outside the individual psyche. This enabled one to come to terms with the activated residues of our ancestral history. The differentiation of the personal from the non-personal resulted in a release of energy. These comments represent another description of his activity, the attempt to differentiate the various characters that appeared and to consolidate them as psychological realities. The notion that these figures had a psychological reality in their own right and were not merely subjective figments was the main lesson that he attributed to the imaginal figure of Elijah, psychic objectivity. Jung argued that the era of reason and skepticism inaugurated by the French Revolution had the effect that religion and irrationalism had been repressed. This had serious consequences, which had led to the outbreak of the irrationalism represented by the World War. It was thus a historical necessity to acknowledge the irrational as a psychological factor. The acceptance of the irrational forms one of the central undertakings in the Black Books. In the psychology of the unconscious processes, Jung develops his concept of psychological types. He noted that the psychological characteristics of the types were commonly pushed to extremes by what he termed the law of enantodromia, or the reversal into the opposite. The opposing function entered in, namely feeling for the introvert and thinking for the extrovert. These secondary functions were found in the unconscious. The development of the contrary functions led to individuation. As the contrary function was not acceptable to consciousness, what was required to come to terms with it was production of the transcendent function. The unconscious was a danger when one was not at all with it, was not at one with it. But with the establishment of the transcendent function, the disharmony ceased. But with the establishment of the transcendent function, the disharmony ceased. This allowed access to productive and beneficent aspects of the unconscious. The unconscious contained the wisdom and experience of untold ages and served as an unparalleled guide. The development of the contrary functions is portrayed in the Mysterium section of Liber Novis, dealing with the December 1913 encounter with Elijah and Salome. The attempt to gain the wisdom stored in the unconscious is portrayed throughout the Black Books. Jung's eye, asks his soul to tell him what she sees and the meaning of his fantasies. The unconscious is here viewed as a source of higher wisdom. Jung concluded the essay by indicating the personal and experiential nature of his new conceptions. Our age is seeking a new spring of life. I found one and drank of it, and the water tasted good.